This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment. It has been said that man is a rational animal. All my life, I have been searching for evidence which could support this. Sometimes, philosophy produces phenomenal ideas. We might think of Aristotle proposing the nascent form of the scientific method, or Gottlob Frege inventing modern logic, or the towering intellectual achievements of Ludwig Wittgenstein. But today, we are not going to look at any of those. Instead, we are going to take a jaunt through philosophical history to look at the strangest, the most surprising, and the most counterintuitive philosophies the canon has to offer. And we will try to find the value in even the most baffling of thoughts. Get ready to learn why you might want to live in a jar, how the entire world may be conscious, and the strange psychological roots of sadism. Since I will be covering a lot of different philosophies here, I will inevitably be sacrificing a little bit of depth for the sake of brevity. So in each case, please bear in mind this is not a complete presentation of any of these philosophies, and if you find any of them interesting, I really do encourage you to look into them for yourselves. So, let's begin with one of the weirdest ideas from the philosophy of mind, that everything, yes, everything, is conscious. But before any of that, I want to briefly thank the very kind sponsor for this video, Squarespace. If you are looking to build a website, then you know it can be a headache. First, you have to find the domain name and then actually build the website, and there is always the underlying fear that you are messing up and creating an unprofessional-looking page. But this is where Squarespace comes in handy. They compress all of this work into a single unified platform and use templates to take most of the complication and pain out of website building. I'm currently using it to build my own website, and despite my own lack of technical ability or any real free time, it has been incredibly straightforward. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a domain name or a website. But anyway, back to strangeness. 1. Everything has a mind. Panpsychism is often presented as the belief that rocks can think, and as a result, it has attracted a lot of negative attention. However, I think this is an unfair strawman of the panpsychist position. Panpsychist philosophers tend to hold that the same mental stuff that gives rise to our minds is almost everywhere in nature. And this is, on the face of it, a very strange position. We don't normally think of inanimate objects as holding any sort of mental properties or even the potential for mental properties. But the view is worth exploring in more detail because it is less ridiculous than it first appears. In modern philosophy, this position often comes about through the recognition of two ideas. The first is the acceptance of the hard problem of consciousness. That is, that a material explanation of the mind will never be able to capture the unique qualia of what it is like to be us. Someone could learn everything they wanted about our brains from the third-person perspective, and yet would still not know what it was like to exist as us from a first-person perspective. Even if they could perfectly describe how we were feeling and perfectly predict our behavior, they still would not have seen the world through our eyes. Secondly, panpsychists tend to reject a hard division between humanity and the rest of the world. Unlike Descartes, who held that humans have a single indivisible soul that contained all of their mental properties, panpsychists often take a much more naturalistic view of the world. They accept that the brain is made out of the same stuff as the rest of the universe, arranged in a certain way. And thus they conclude that if mental states cannot be reduced to some other type of property, then whatever is giving rise to our consciousness must already be there in other objects as well. This is why Galen Strawson describes himself as coming to panpsychism through materialism. It's worth noting this is a far cry from saying that rocks can think. A nice way of explaining this view actually draws from recent research done by Erich Schwitzgebel on borderline conscious states. So, you watching this video right now are conscious and have an awful lot of complex mental properties. You are seeing, cognizing, judging, and hopefully enjoying. But then imagine that you suddenly became very tired. Then you would probably have fewer mental properties or experience those properties with much less intensity. To kick it up a notch, now imagine that someone has removed half your brain. Unless you were extraordinarily lucky, you would plausibly lose a whole bunch more of your mental properties. And if we kept taking away greater and greater amounts of grey matter, you would eventually reach a point where we probably could not really say whether you were conscious or not. So, Schwitzgebel argues that mental properties come in degrees. The panpsychist can then extend this argument one step further. In their view, there is no one point where it makes sense to say there are no longer any mental properties at all. And thus, if they are non-reductionists, they must concede that the mental properties go all the way down. Or at the very least, the potential to have mental properties does. Of course, the plausibility of this view greatly depends on how we interpret the idea of mental properties. We normally look at mental properties in their complex or sophisticated forms, such as in thoughts, feelings, and ideas. But many panpsychists will say that as we move further and further away from humans, these ways of talking become less apt. For instance, most people would say that ants probably have mental properties in some way, but they might not ascribe thoughts or ideas to them. In the same way, the panpsychist is not arguing that a rock can think, but rather that the same fundamental subatomic building blocks that form the rock can also be made to form thoughts if arranged correctly, as in the human brain. And furthermore, that this is explained by those mental properties existing in a very basic form in the building blocks themselves. It is a bit like how the ancient Greek philosopher Democritus theorized that if you kept cutting something in half, you will eventually come to a point where you can no longer half it anymore. And he called this thing an atom. In his view, the reason that, say, a brick is material is because it is made out of atoms, and atoms are material in a much more basic way. Despite the weirdness of the panpsychist position, this is actually a very familiar reasoning pattern in both philosophy and science. The reason some people are drawn to this view is because, despite an awful lot of neuroscientific process, we still rub against this hard problem of consciousness. That is, capturing all the information of human subjective experience, that ineffable usness, completely in terms of objective third-person brain states. For many people, the appeal of panpsychism is that it sidesteps this issue entirely, without making it mysterious why scientific inquiry is so useful when looking at psychological states, or why the human mind is so affected by the state of the brain. If the fundamental building blocks of human consciousness are there in the micro-consciousness of the particles the brain is made out of, then it makes total sense why the human mind would depend on the human brain. It is no more mysterious than asking how a set of Legos can be rearranged into the shape of the Millennium Falcon. In fact, this theory allows for a much easier articulation of the idea that the human mind and the human brain are the same thing than classic materialist theories. The hope is that it will dissolve the hard problem of consciousness rather than solve it in a traditional sense. This is one reason why panpsychism has had a bit of a revival amongst very hard-nosed empiricist analytic philosophers. They often argue that it bridges the gap between the mind and the brain in a way that means neuroscience and empirical psychology can proceed, unimpeded by worries about subjective experience or qualia. So, from a certain angle, panpsychism does not fly in the face of empirical science, but becomes very amenable to it. Far more so than many classic theories of mind, including ones we normally think of as scientific. When I used to run some discussion groups about philosophy, I would occasionally use panpsychism as a good example of a view that at first seems absurd, but then becomes strangely more plausible the more you look at it. It is still a very difficult pill to swallow, and I personally wouldn't call myself a panpsychist, but it does highlight how easy it is for caricatures of philosophical positions to be parroted uncritically, and for us to miss out on some potentially very interesting thinking as a result. Additionally, whether or not you find panpsychism ridiculous or a live option in the philosophy of mind, it represents a kind of approach to philosophical problem solving that is genuinely admirable. Most philosophies of mind attempt to bridge the gap between the mind and the body by either reducing the mind to the body, which has turned out to be much easier said than done, or by completely separating the mind from the body and then making mental states this mysterious otherworldly property that seems to require its own explanatory theory. Panpsychism takes an original and orthogonal approach by neither trying to reduce the mental to the physical or making the mental mysterious, but rather conceiving of mental properties as something you see every day in rather primitive forms. Just like we are not surprised when many bricks can make a house, a panpsychist is not surprised when many basic mental states can form a human mind. What at first might seem a near insoluble problem simply falls away with a fresh perspective. Of course, panpsychism does have its own issues. It is far from a perfect philosophy. But, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into it here. I may make a full video on panpsychism in the future, because I do find it fascinating. But next, I want to look at one of the strangest views in ancient philosophy. That change itself is an illusion, and that almost everything exists in some sense. 2. Parmenides and The Real. Some of philosophy's strangest thoughts come from the ancient world, where norms of inquiry were not nearly as fixed as they are now, and the possibilities for existence seemed endless. And this is where we find the creative and confusing mind of Parmenides. Parmenides proposed a very novel philosophical theory, that nothing in the world ever truly changed. At first, this seems incredibly bizarre. Surely we can see change occurring all around us. With every passing moment, the air current shifts, dust particles move. Over the years, we ourselves change as we grow older. What could Parmenides possibly say that would convince us that change does not exist? Well, interestingly, Parmenides thinks that asserting change will involve us contradicting ourselves. In the fragments of his philosophy that we still have, his argument seems to go something like this, though I will simplify it for brevity. Change consists of things coming into and going out of existence. But when we talk about things and ascribe them properties, we are committed to them existing. Thus, everything we refer to must exist and exist without change. He pictures this unchanging world of existence as a unified whole, which makes quite a lot of sense, since with no change or differentiation, it does seem like the world would look like one big, static lump of stuff. It is the second part of his argument, that when we talk about things we are committed to them existing, which is by far the most controversial. His view here stems from observing the way we talk. If I make the statement, Romeo loves Juliet, that seems like it's true. But for Parmenides, if Romeo loves Juliet, then he must exist in some sense of the word, since non-existent things cannot love. Thus, in order for the statement Romeo loves Juliet to be true, Romeo must be in some way, even if the precise sense in which he exists still remains unclear. Moreover, since this statement will always be true, he must continue to exist, unchanging, for eternity. The same could be said for historical statements. If I say that Henry VIII once married Anne Boleyn, then that is true of Henry VIII, and thus he must, in this Parmenidean way, still exist. Thus, Parmenides concludes that whatever our appearances tell us, the world of truth must be an unchanging, undifferentiated mass of being. Now, from a modern perspective, it is very easy to see where Parmenides has gone wrong in his reasoning. When we say Romeo loves Juliet, this is just a contracted version of the larger expression, in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, there is a character called Romeo, and in the narrative, he loves Juliet. Parmenides is right that there is a sense in which Romeo exists, but that sense is purely fictional. He exists as lines in a play, and nothing more than this. It's a very different kind of existence from material or metaphysically loaded existence, like how I would say my desk or my jumper exist. The same can be said for Henry VIII. While he in some sense exists, the existence is only historical. It refers to facts that occurred in the past, which seems much less problematic than suggesting that Henry VIII still exists in the present day. However, despite the strangeness of Parmenides' position, I do think this is a fantastic example to bring out some key ideas in the nature of reasoning that are definitely worth looking at. The first thing to note is that Parmenides' argument trades on the vagueness of the word exist, or be. Essentially, he takes one idea of what it means to exist, to be used in a truth-bearing sentence, and equates that with the metaphysically loaded sense of being that we use when we say that objects exist, or that our minds exist. What, at first glance, seems to be a simple concept, after all, what could be more straightforward than saying a thing exists, is revealed as a multifaceted notion. Things can exist within fiction or outside of it, or in our heads as ideas. But all of this is obscured if we only recognize one sense of the word being. Right, so far, so obvious. But the thing is, Parmenides was known as a highly respected and clever man. He was a huge influence on Plato and broadly recognized to not be an idiot. So the fact that he can go wrong in this way tells us something. The vagueness of our concepts is not always obvious to us, and we can start to form some very strange arguments when we do not realize this. From bizarre ontology, we gain some pretty valuable methodology. Parmenides has often thought to have been led astray by the fact that he only used one word for being, and that the different meanings were not far enough apart for its vagueness to be recognized. But it is entirely possible that many of our concepts contain hidden pluralities that mislead our own faculties of reason. These cluster concepts can fool us into thinking our thought is more precise than it actually is, and we can fall into our own Parmenidean traps as a result. Similarly, Parmenides' argument raises another philosophical question. When are we committed to believing in something? His argument trades on the idea that if we refer to an object in a truth-bearing sentence, we are also committed to believing that that object exists in some way. Our response has not actually challenged this. We have just massively deflated the implications of the word exist to include fictional existence and historical existence. This allowed us to reintroduce change into the world pretty unproblematically, since things can pass from present existence to historical existence. That is, from present to past. Many religious thinkers, including most recently Jordan Peterson, have argued that if you act in an ethical way, this implies that you already believe in God. You can check out my video here to see why I disagree with him, but there is a genuine question here. If I told you that I did not believe in the floor of my flat, but at the same time I continued to live here and walk upon it without displaying fear that I would tumble to the flat below me, then you would have good reason to say that whatever I think I believe, in practice, I do believe that the floor exists. Even as early as Parmenides, we see these key issues at the intersection of ontology, epistemology, and logic emerging. And I think that is incredibly interesting in its own right. Parmenides is also an excellent example of why I think it is worth examining these seemingly quite insane philosophies. Oftentimes, they are put forward by reported geniuses, and finding out where a genius has gone wrong is a fantastic exercise for exploring the potential holes in our own thinking. We all have blind spots, and seeing them in others can bring our own to our attention, especially when they lead to fun and bizarre philosophies, as in the case of Parmenides. And, sticking with the ancient theme, I want to look at one of the most famous and infamous philosophical critics in history. 3. Living like a dog. Diogenes the Cynic is one of those philosophical figures who has become a legend, not because of the books he published or the lectures he gave, but instead the stories of his life, which almost always feature him being in some way aggressive, insolent, or irreverent, often to the detriment of his own safety. The first strange thing about Diogenes was his daily life. He chose to live as a beggar on the streets of both Athens and Corinth, and deliberately went homeless, living in a large ceramic jar, often mistranslated as a barrel. He would defecate and urinate in the street, and even pleasure himself in public. When he was reproached about this, he simply responded that he wished he could relieve hunger in a similar way by rubbing his belly. His particular philosophical oeuvre was to essentially berate everyone he came across, targeting their hypocrisy or stupidity or both for his own amusement, and, allegedly, for the betterment of their character. In an ancient world held together by the communities of city-states, Diogenes lived in a way totally at odds with the social order. He was often beaten in the street, yet at the same time he earned the begrudging respect of the people, who bought him a new jar when his was broken by some ruffians. And he came to be honoured years after his death, both by his home city and by his chosen cities. Most of the specific stories about his life are in a similar vein of anti-authority and anti-society thinking. In one, he demonstrates how much he scorned wealth and comfort by pressing his bare body up to stone in the dead of winter. In another, he was approached by Alexander the Great, who offered Diogenes anything he could want. He could have had great riches or a manor in Macedonia. Yet the curmudgeonly old philosopher simply asked Alexander to move out of his sunlight. In response to this, Alexander reportedly said that if he were not himself, he would want to be Diogenes. Yet another legend tells of him being captured by Alexander's father, Philip of Macedon, where he proceeded to mock the king and his court with such humour and virility that Philip let him go, clearly respecting the cynical thinker. Diogenes was also said to hate the academic abstract style of philosophy advanced by Plato, and he mocked Plato's whole methodology. In response to him trying to define a man as a featherless biped, Diogenes strode into the academy, threw down a plucked chicken, and proclaimed it was Plato's man. For Diogenes, Plato was a false inheritor of Socrates' legacy, which he thought was better served by his own work out on the street than by Plato's lectures and academic systems. But while people enjoy sharing anecdotes about Diogenes, most do not genuinely want to partake in his lifestyle and view his philosophy as odd. It is an extreme position which views human society as an ill which keeps us from our natural state. Its shamelessness and antisociality tends to turn people off it entirely. And while Diogenes is not as widely mocked as some of the other views in this video, he is nonetheless seen as a deeply strange philosopher. Most people who hear of his exploits probably consider him an eccentric who did some funny things, and not much more than this. But this is a shame, because despite its weirdness, Diogenes' approach has some real philosophical insight. Now, I have a whole video on his philosophy more generally, so I won't recap it all here. But, in effect, he embodied an approach to philosophy that is fundamentally critical. He was a master at seeking out the contradictions and arbitrariness in societal norms and exposing them for all to see in a visceral fashion. And this is not always a bad thing. His scorn for Alexander's power reflects a general skepticism he had about power inherited by birth, and it's one that many of us share today. His living disdain for his social superiors is as compelling as any argument from Rousseau, because Diogenes serves as an example of someone who held them in contempt and was nonetheless considered wise for it. At least in hindsight, at the time more people took issue with it. Diogenes also exemplifies a practical side to philosophy that we do not always see. For him, philosophy was not just a way of answering questions about the universe or ethics or politics, but it was a way of life. He took his own ideas seriously and attempted to live by them to the fullest extent possible. The way he lived was undoubtedly strange, but it followed from the ideas he held about the world. He thought that mankind should live in accordance with nature, so he did just that. He viewed the social structures of ancient Hellas as arbitrary at best and outright cruel at worst, so he mocked and ridiculed them, turning philosophy into a weapon for societal critique. And, like Socrates before him, Diogenes was willing to suffer for his beliefs. He partly seems strange because he showed such unusual and extreme conviction in his views. Rather than declaiming all society as wrong and then being an upstanding member of it anyway, he took to philosophical rebellion. Though we may not want to copy the particulars of his life, what with all the nudity, lack of hygiene, and getting beaten up in the town square, we might still admire his willingness to live out the philosophy that he preached. There is also a more general lesson here about how to approach the strange habits of some of these ancient thinkers. While Diogenes' way of living, or Pythagoras' belief that eating beans was wrong, may seem incredibly odd to many of us today, this is normally because these were implied by their wider worldview. And what strikes us as a bout of madness was, to them, simply an example of integrity. As with Diogenes, often we have something to learn even from the most bizarre of ancient thinkers, even if it's just gaining a perspective that is so radically different from the ones that we hold in the modern age. But lastly, I want to examine a man who is sometimes called a philosopher and other times simply a monster. He died in an insane asylum, and is where we get the word sadism, because his ideas were not just strange, but show some of the darkest aspects of Enlightenment thinking. 4. Sadism as philosophy. Optimism is often seen as the philosophy of fools. Funnily enough, I'm working on a video on this very topic at the moment, and so I've been reading a lot of critiques of optimism for this. Many philosophers, such as Voltaire, Schopenhauer, and Seneca, have criticized excessive optimism for not recognizing the less pleasant sides of life, and preventing people from actually doing something about their condition. Others have said that an optimistic viewpoint is just too out of touch with reality to be worthy of philosophical respect. However, there is a thinker that represents the extreme opposite view. Someone whose ideas are noteworthy not because they are optimistic, but because they are perhaps some of the most depressing and hostile of all time. This is the philosophy of the Marquis de Sade. Sade was known for his obscene and graphic novels, which are sometimes called erotic, but I really don't think that's the right word. They depict unimaginable cruelty, both sexual and non-sexual, and were largely written out of frustration when Sade was locked up in the Bastille. His ideas go one step further than someone like Diogenes, because whereas the cynic criticized social norms, he was still a firm believer in ethics. Sade's ultimate target in his philosophy is the concept of morality itself. It is sometimes difficult to tell exactly what Sade believed, because he primarily wrote novels and expressed his views through his characters. The first proposition of his philosophy is that virtue is foolish and inadvisable. His most famous work, Justine, bears the subtitle The Misfortunes of Virtue for this reason. Throughout his works, he condemns basically any ethical theory as an unacceptable constraint on human instincts, chief of which was the libido. Albert Camus has a wonderful analysis of Sade's philosophy, and I will largely be drawing upon that in this section. In his infamous work, 100 Days of Sodom, Sade tells the story of some wealthy libertines who imprison a group of victims to subject them to all sorts of horrific acts. At the beginning of the novel, the libertines outline their philosophy. As far as the world is concerned, their victims are already dead. Their moral status is of no concern to the libertines, who care only for raw power. They abhor any sort of attachment or sympathy for the victims, and make it clear that they can expect no form of compassion or kindness within these walls. In any other novel, this would be a villain's speech, but Sade almost frames it as heroic. Perversely, Sade thinks this is what the powerful ought to be doing, wearing their instinctual cruelty on their sleeve. Sade consistently praises the kind of crimes that are done in the name of passion and baseness. However, this goes hand in hand with a firm condemnation of any sort of legal cruelty. In one of his other works, The Philosophy of the Boudoir, we get the closest thing to a mouthpiece for Sade's own position. Here, he praises the French Revolution for overthrowing the tyranny of the king, but he suggests they must go one step further and abolish morality itself. Sade argues that just like the king was a physical tyranny over France, religion, and specifically ethics, represented a mental or philosophical tyranny. He saw it as hypocritical to make freedom the primary value of your society and then try to impose limits upon it by using law and ethics. It is why, despite praising passionate murderers, Sade also hated the death penalty. He saw it as the ultimate hypocrisy of the state, and devoid of any of the base human instinct that he thought justified ordinary crime. This is, perhaps, the bizarrest ethical philosophy I have ever come across. Because, unlike thinkers such as Max Stirner or Nietzsche, who talk about the death of morality and also how we should react to it, and do so along gently egoistic lines, Sade's philosophy is not just anti-moral, but outright self-destructive. The libertines in his stories are often not exercising cruelty in order to achieve some separate egoistic goal. It is rather that the cruelty is the point. Sade praises transgression for its own sake. And, as Camus points out, the extremity of this philosophy means that it will eventually devour itself if it is ever adopted as an ethos. In the first place, the libertines primarily enjoy their behavior because of its transgressive aspects, but if they go about destroying morality, then they are also undermining their very ability to transgress those moral boundaries. Their philosophy is parasitic upon the structure they wish to undermine, so the moment they achieve victory would be the exact same moment at which they destroy themselves as well. And this would not just be a symbolic destruction either. Camus emphasizes how Sade's philosophy relies on a division between libertines and victims, but also then attempts to destroy the whole class of victims. But when there are no more victims, what can the libertines do except turn on one another? Since it is a philosophy without production and only destruction, Camus suggests it will eat itself until there is only one man left on earth who will be king of the lifeless ashes. This is why he deems it more an aspect of Sade's supposed madness than a considered philosophy. But if this is true, it is important to note it is madness born of Sade's own life experience. Camus says that in the extraordinary conditions of the Bastille, his pre-existing proclivities towards sadomasochism became exaggerated and transformed into a raging hot frustration and resentment against the forces that kept him trapped there. Sade's rage was then channeled into his writings and his philosophy, which were the manifestations of a wish to lash out at society and at legalism. Sade's ideas became so strange because he did not have the same goals as most other philosophers. Whereas someone like Plato or Rousseau or even Nietzsche wanted to progress humanity in the direction they saw as best, Sade's aim was fundamentally destructive. He was in favor of the total exploitation of one person by another, and the fact that this would eventually end in the collapse of civilization and the extinction of the human race probably would not bother him all that much. This resulted in a philosophy that was cruel, brutal, and above all, alien. But, amongst all this, there is a lesson for when we are reading the ideas of certain thinkers and immediately find them absurd. Sometimes they seem bizarre not because they have the same goals we do and are just failing miserably to achieve them, but because they have a totally different starting point. This could be a difference in fundamental ethics, such as with Sade, but it could also be a metaphysical difference, such as when medieval philosophers baffle us with all of their talk of teleology that we tend not to use much in the modern day. Having the context of Sade's aims and his background make his philosophy understandable, even if we almost certainly still do not agree with it. And I would gently encourage this attitude when we come across philosophies or thinkers that seem to be talking complete nonsense or whose views seem so bizarre as to become incomprehensible. Oftentimes, digging a little bit deeper will reveal how their thinking has originated. And then, even though we may still strongly disagree with them, we will have a better understanding of the structure of their thought. Because, to add an addendum to Socrates' famous maxim to know thyself, sometimes it is worth knowing someone completely different. But if you want to look into the wild world of Diogenes further, I have a video on his own cynical, rebellious philosophy right here. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.